Thank you guys so much for coming to our first official Neuroanthropology Club meeting. Thank you so much for coming out. We're really excited about this club, particularly Bree and I, and that we're neuroanth students studying under Dr. Lende. We're really interested in this subject because it talks about how anthropology can be used in studies, in cognitive science studies, as well as cognitive science studies being used in anthropology. So basically merging the brain and culture, which I'm sure you guys read on our awesome flyer. Although we're affiliated with the anthropology department here at USF, really the goal is to make this an interdisciplinary conversation. Right, so obviously studies with cognitive science, psychology, they're used in conversation with anthropology oftentimes, but neuroanthropology really seeks to understand and unpack the processes of how those two intermingle and are entangled with one another.
That's one of the things neuroanthropology was really about from the start, was trying to figure out how we can combine ideas from different fields to better understand real-world problems. Neuroscience is really, really exciting, but a lot of neuroscience is done in laboratory settings or in its applied settings like clinics. And we don't know really how to apply ideas from, broadly speaking, cognitive sciences out into the domains where anthropologists have long been specialists, out in the field settings. And so the idea was, how can we do some real-world testing of ideas that are coming in different academic environments and with different methods often than are used in clinical or laboratory settings. At the same time, anthropology needs the other sciences. We need to engage in ideas that can illuminate problems that come up in our field sites. And in my personal case, it was because I was working with addiction, and I realized that some of what I was seeing among my informants in Colombia and South America was illuminated by research on the dopamine system in the brain, and this was work being done in the United States. At that time, it was actually being done with animal models, and they said, well, we think it applies to humans. Of course it should, but they didn't know, right? And so I was able to draw on those ideas about the dopamine system and say, is this actually coming up in the everyday experience of people who have serious problems, and does it not come up? Does other things come up in people who don't engage in drug use? And similarly, the co-founder of a lot of what we've done in neuroanthropology, my colleague Greg Downey, in his field site in Brazil, was working as an apprentice in capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial art, a dance art where you spend a lot of time doing cartwheels and upside down, but you can't spot like you might do in dance. So how do these people do balance? And that was what he got interested in. But the first step was for him to take his informants seriously when they said, doing capoeira makes us different. Not feel different, not think differently, but physically we are different. We act and react in different ways. And he said, well, what if it's not just a cultural meaning? What if what they're saying is actually has some physiological basis? And he started to, again, look at cognitive science, look at neuroscience to really say, how does the body and some of the sensory systems in the body come into play in what my informants are saying? It's sort of truth testing using a different paradigm than just with the informants and just on the other side, the cognitive science, and trying to say, can these match up? And they did. They did quite well. And so we think this type of approach is broadly applicable to lots of problems. And we've successfully published in 2012 The Encultured Brain, a collection of approaches to this, and now we're working on a new book called Brains in the Wild to sort of push the paradigm forward. But actually the most important thing to expanding how this works is to have people engage in it. And so it's really exciting for me to see students come along, to see neuroanthropology be taught at other universities, and now today to have a club here dedicated to that, where we'll be able to bring undergrads and graduate students and faculty together to discuss where the field might go, what is it missing, what types of methods might be relevant, but also to have fun. Okay? One of the things that we really like in neuroanthropology, or just broadly I think in academia, is to remember that it can be fun. Right? It doesn't all have to be tests. Right? It doesn't all have to be memorizing certain things. We can learn through other ways of approaching ideas, of playing with ideas, of seeing how we can get ideas from astronomy together with ideas that might come from psychology. Who knows? I don't know. That's fun. It's fun to see how those things can come together. And we can only do that if we have a room of people who are willing to come and participate and give those ideas into a space where we can all hear them, listen to them, play with them. So you guys have already spanned like the brain, individual experience, people, society, norms, right? And that's a lot to try to put together. And one of the really important ways to think about how to do that is to not get so focused on present views of how to think about things. So, for example, in anthropology, we often focus at a really macro level, right? We focus on society and culture and stuff like that. A lot of you also are interested in questions about how culture feels, how it gets under the skin, what sort of impact does it have on groups of people, on our biology through our microbiome. And so paying attention to not just the macro level, but the interactions that people have with it, people there in the center. On the other side, neuroscience is often seen as just running psychology, right? But if we're serious about culture running through the brain, it also has to run culture in a certain way or interact with culture. And that means it's going to do something really different from most models of neuroscience, which are often drawn from a folk psychology. And then in the middle, psychology is really focused often on a Western idea about the mind. And so when we can broaden our understanding of how minds might actually work, that they might be more expansive or open. And there are a lot of psychologists actually exploring this. They have ideas about extended minds. And so trying to think about how you can piece together ideas and have a framework by which you can tackle these different types of problems is something that's still being built, right? But the one thing I'm convinced about is really the first generation of sort of cognitive science came in the 1950s and was often sort of driven by models of computers at that point and algorithms and game theory. And then the second wave was really driven by the cognitive revolution in psychological science. But as neuroscience advanced in the 90s and then into 2000s, the brain started to look a lot different, even more weird and more plastic than we had thought before. And so suddenly we started to realize that brains can interact in ways that didn't necessarily get boiled down to the older models, right? So a lot of this is summarized under the idea of plasticity, neuroplasticity. And trying to understand how that might come into an area that has spent decades studying how people do weird things, crazy things, fun things, anthropological things, has been a really exciting development, because in the next wave of sort of synthesis of our understanding of who we are, how we vary, the different ways we can live and experience, anthropology needs to be a better player in saying our models need to go further than they have before. And so for that, you need to ask questions, right? You need to say, these sorts of things, we don't have as good as answers as we should, right? Any one of these, it's all about understanding ourselves, right? And the things we do to ourselves, right? Take incarceration. Most people would say, well, what does that have to do with psychology? But it's a profoundly debilitating experience, right? From the way people are socially isolated, isolated through their senses, punished, right? And then the defiance that can come in as they are in these settings. And anthropologists have looked at that. They've looked at how supermax prisons work, right? But they don't always have a model to understand why is it so profoundly debilitating, right? And how does the environment around that, the environments we create and which feed back onto ourselves, impact us? And I think for lots of issues going forward, that is the number one thing. We're at a point where we have incredible control of our environment, but we don't understand how we control it. And to be able to grasp that, we need case studies like incarceration, or looking at social norms, or how society impacts self, because then maybe we can do a better job at trying to attend to a lot of people who are left behind, who are negatively impacted, or just flourish more ourselves, right? Like with the food stuff, it's fascinating what's happening with food and the whole food culture and everything that's changing, and the understandings of the microbiome. And the understanding that how your gut, which has actually a huge collection of neurons, right? Sort of a second brain. Well, what does that do, and how does that interact with the immune system? How does all that interact with cardiovascular health? And all those things then shape the brain, right? It's not the brain always shaping other things. The brain can be shaped by these other factors, right? We had a great talk last night on dementia and how cardiovascular health is really important to it, but so is social contact and having people who care. And that's where we need to go in terms of trying to understand everyday problems. Not that neuroanthropology is the only way to do that, but it's a fun way to do it, right? And brings in ideas and evidences that aren't necessarily considered by other fields. So this is an exciting list.